Star Wars Episode 7 is something I wanted since I was a literal child. Following the 2005 release of Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith, Star Wars sat in limbo from a live-action perspective for about a decade. At one point, we were promised a live-action show, Star Wars Underground. But everyone kind of had the same question. What's next for Star Wars? Star Wars was thriving in other media. Dark Horse was releasing comics monthly, novels were being released several times a year, the Clone Wars TV show came to television and lasted for quite a while, and games were dropping, including heavily pushed games like The Force Unleashed. But in terms of what was next from a cinematic standpoint, there wasn't much from George Lucas besides the occasional hint that he had ideas for a potential sequel. While the franchise was dormant from a film perspective, we started to really see people turn on the prequels a bit from a fandom perspective. Films like The People vs. George Lucas, the Untitled Star Wars mockumentary, and web videos like the prequel Plinkett reviews from Red Letter Media created this air of disdain for the prequels, especially from Gen X, though for me, this disdain for the films kind of interested me, especially since I was starting to come of age a bit and started realizing these films that I saw as these dramatic life and death conflicts as a child were actually confusing, long and stilted adventure films so focused on pushing the lore that they kind of forgot to put adventure in the adventure films. I was born in 1998 and was introduced to Star Wars pretty young, Attack of the Clones being my first theatrical memory, which, like, Mom, if you're listening to this, don't bring a 4-year-old to a movie theater. I was probably really fucking annoying. But it was also a pretty formative moment for me, so fuck anyone that was mad at me in 2002 at the Minnesota Zoo showing of Attack of the Clones. Anyhow, as I started viewing these films as kind of weird and not great, but mixed in with deeply rooted nostalgia, it started breathing a second life into the films for me, and I started enjoying them possibly more than ever before. I remember watching these films at the theater my friend worked at, smoking some bongs after close and just reciting lines with my pals, which is some of my favorite memories from high school.
Another happy landing.
I also think this revived my interest in the franchise, so hearing new films were on the way was probably the last time I was truly anxious to see a new film. Nowadays, shit gets pushed out too fast, so I don't really care. But I remember in 2015, it was so agonizing for me because I wanted to see this film so badly. I was at work when the teaser trailer dropped for this film, and I don't think I ever cared that much about a trailer in my life. It was mind-blowing, like, holy fuck, Star Wars is back, and it isn't a total CGI nightmare like the prequel films were.
Dark side.
Eventually I would see the film. I skipped school that day and my friends and I watched all 6 Star Wars films in order in anticipation. I had this girl I was seeing at the time break it off with me because I refused to come over to her house since I was too busy watching Star Wars. I ended up just simply never talking to her again. But I was unbothered since I was going to see Star Wars on the big screen. Anyhow, I thought I got tickets in the back row, but it turns out I got tickets in the front row of the theater, and it was 3D. So I got really dizzy watching the film the first time, and I fell asleep like 45 minutes into the film, resigned with just watching it the next day. The next day, though, I was right back at the theater, and I thought it was pretty good. Like everyone else, I had theories on who Snoke was, who's Rey's parents, and how badass it'll be when she has to fight the Knights of Ren, and none of that really worked out, but still. Okay, but forget my long, droning personal anecdotes about my relationship with Star Wars in 2015. What is more important to you, and I guess this video, is how this film came to be. As I said, George Lucas was working on ideas for the sequel trilogy, but never seriously planned on making it for numerous reasons, including George just sort of sitting on his franchises like Star Wars and Indiana Jones theatrically. Lucas decided to sell Lucasfilm and its franchises with it after initially meeting Disney on a potential distribution deal for Lucasfilm's franchises. saying that he was looking to retire from filmmaking to pursue other interests like his preservation and museum works that he's been working on ever since, and the fact that the man was just getting too old to run the circus that is Lucasfilm anymore. So Bob Iger led Disney to offer Lucas $4.05 billion, with approximately half the sum coming in stocks for Disney and the other half being hard cash, with Kathleen Kennedy sliding into the role of president and overseer of Lucasfilm Properties, having previously worked as the co-chairman of the board at Lucasfilm for a couple years up to this point, and having produced numerous projects in the past like Gremlins, The Goonies, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the Back to the Future trilogy, E.T., The Color Purple, Jurassic Park, Lincoln, Indiana Jones, and The Land Before Time. Like, honestly, unless Steven Spielberg himself was going to hop on board to helm Lucasfilm, no one else on paper was really more qualified to run Star Wars, and I think fans kind of forget that today, acting like she came out of nowhere for being a woman or whatever. This is not to say she hasn't had missteps, but goddamn, I hate some of these online Star Wars, trolls, pathetic losers, whatever you want to call them.
They don't want to embrace the expanded universe, which is the real canon. They don't want to read books. They just want their shit-ass live-action Star Wars on Communist Plus.
Anyhow, at first, things were pretty chill with George Lucas, who was, for a time, creative consultant on the universe to help the thing gain some legs based on his specifications. But this didn't turn out very well, with Lucas's story ideas basically going directly into the dumpster, at which time he departed Lucasfilm for good and for the most part has largely remained away from the series ever since, with the exception of Solo, since his buddy Ron Howard took over that film halfway through production, and Ron Howard actually seemed to want some of his input. Man, I don't love late era George Lucas as a director, but they did do him kinda dirty here. Regardless, they told that dinosaur to not let the door hit his ass on the way out. George's concept was intended to be more original than the Disney films, which definitely relied heavily on the original trilogy era as the backbone for the series. The original idea was a coming of age about a woman becoming a Jedi Knight. This woman had a few names. Thea, Winky, and Terran were all considered, but the core didn't change over time. Much like Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi, Luke is an outcast after tragedy struck him and the Jedi Order. It'd be more fairy tale-like in nature, featuring midichlorians and wills, a concept George made up early on in his writing of the original Star Wars film. Wills are basically force germs that use us as vessels for the Force to control. With George adamant, the story of the wills has always been his endgame. George was going to do away with stormtroopers, though. They would have been gone, with a concept art showing perhaps a more contained story than the galaxy-wide adventures of the prequels or the original trilogy. This trilogy, being the sequel trilogy, would have followed Anakin's grandchildren since, it's the Skywalker saga. George likened this film to the Iraq War, where rather than large-scale conflicts, the Republic's new problem is terrorism and small-pocket militias trying to disrupt the peace following the destruction of their armies during the original series, with the New Republic basically fighting an inverted version of their former rebellion when the Empire was in power. Darth Maul, who was revived in the Clone Wars, would have been the main villain of the film, taking over for the Emperor basically, and being this old, decrepit, powerful in the Force monster man. It's worth noting George Lucas's draft, like the final film, would ignore the wider extended universe for the most part, and the way George Lucas talked about Darth Maul in this potential version of Episode 7, it is possible they may have also ignored the Clone Wars TV show as well, although we don't know that for sure. Darth Talon was supposed to be Maul's Padawan, which is a character pulled from the Dark Horse comic Star Wars Legacy, though that comic takes place in the far future of Star Wars, beyond even this potential film by around 100 years, so it's likely he just thought the female Twi'lek Sith Lord idea was cool and kind of pulled it into this. Anyhow, this character would be the sort of action foil to the lead woman, whatever her name would have been, Winky or what have you. This character over time would evolve into Snoke, with later treatments as the film changed hands, making her the master and having her train a Sith apprentice, sort of like Kylo Ren, before she was cut out and replaced in that Emperor role with Snoke. Darth Maul and Talon ended up taking over the crime syndicates rather than the whole empire in this trilogy, since there wasn't much of a formal empire in the trilogy. This aspect would be reused in Solo a Star Wars story with Maul heading Crimson Dawn.
Bring the ship and come to me on Dathomir, and you and I will then decide what to do about the traitor Beckett.
Lucas worked a bit on that film, as I said, so it's possible this is a suggestion he made to Ron Howard. Further, it would be established that around 50 Jedi survived Order 66 and would help Luke rebuild the Jedi, who want to keep the old traditions of finding Force-sensitive kids, which would make most of the organization young children. Question really is, would this be in place during the core series, or did something happen to the Jedi a second time, leading to Luke's exile, as happened in the final trilogy? Anyhow, by the end of the trilogy, Luke was supposed to have some level of the Jedi organization restored, with Leia taking over as Supreme Chancellor, running the whole New Republic, which presumably is happy and safe. It is a little weird that Leia becomes the Supreme Chancellor in charge of everything, as Lucas says, since that absolute control seems like what the whole series is fighting against.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
You know, free will and democracy and whatever. Look, there are some good ideas and many really stupid ones in this pitch. I think the trilogy would have been very lore heavy, fantasy heavy, and would have felt nothing like the other two trilogies. Looking at the concept art, I get a really isolated and lived in vibe. The thing that I think would have made or broke the film was the wills concept and how much they wrote all that, since I think cognate bacteria that controls us like meat puppets might have been a bit far for many fans of the franchise to handle, and might feel like a bit of an aside from what we already have. It also sounded like it was intended to be less action than the previous films in a lot of ways. I don't know, certainly sounds interesting, I suppose. Anyhow, Michael Arndt and Lawrence Kasdan helped George Lucas on these scripts, but Arndt left shortly after George did, with J.J. Abrams, Simon Kinberg, and Lawrence Kasdan and Pablo Hidalgo being tasked with writing The Thing in the Disney era, forming a writer's room for the film. Which, usually when there's that many cooks in the kitchen, it doesn't turn out super well. And yeah, I might be getting ahead of myself a bit here. But some of the writing in this film is so scattershot, it's not surprising there were so many cooks in the kitchen. Anyhow, Lawrence Kasdan is known for Raiders of the Lost Ark and Empire Strikes Back, being the legacy writer more or less. J.J. Abrams has done lots of stuff, with him being fresh off of his 2 Star Trek films for Paramount when he jumped into this, which isn't all that surprising because those films felt more interested in being Star Wars films than Star Trek films. So they said, I guess let's get that guy. And Simon Kinberg went uncredited but worked on most of the Fox Marvel films, which, yeah, those are pretty mixed. And Pablo Hidalgo rounded out the team, being the lore guy. Never a formal screenwriter, just more of a lore master to make sure no one went too far out of bounds. For a while, it was planned that Luke Skywalker would pop up midway through the film to assist Rey, but the writers had a hard time working with the new characters much when Luke would show up, since Luke would just be this god-tier Jedi that had a personal relationship with all the other characters that Rey and Finn lacked, opting to make Han Solo the route to the original trilogy in Luke's place. This also allowed to make Luke more of a mythical legend in the film, with the coordinates to Luke's location being the central MacGuffin that pushes the plot forward. Other lore that wasn't necessarily in the film would also be established as well to kind of bridge the gap for third-party media and the like, things like how Han and Leia's relationship fell apart, Kylo Ren's corruption to the dark side, and how Leia's standing in the New Republic would fold following the revelation that she is Darth Vader's daughter. This would keep more consistency with the side media like novels, comics, and whatnot. At this time, the director pool was fairly diverse. You had David Fincher considered, mostly known for his dark dramas. I think that makes no sense to me, but apparently he was on the shortlist for a while. Brad Bird, who mainly worked in animation, but at the time recently proved himself a bit, cutting his teeth in live action on Mission Impossible 4. Jon Favreau, who did Iron Man and Iron Man 2 relatively recently at the time and helped launch the MCU, which at this point was becoming Disney's major cash cow. Favreau, of course, went on to do The Mandalorian, and his Star Wars film, The Mandalorian and Grogu, is dropping next year. Finally, you had Guillermo del Toro, the king of franchise director shortlists. This man has almost directed every movie ever in the history of mankind, only for it to be canceled and someone else replaces him. The Hobbit was almost him, Justice League Dark, the list goes on and on. Matthew Vaughn dropped out of directing X-Men Days of Future Past at one point after it seems like he was probably going to get the job, and then he would not be picked. Colin Trevorrow was considered and almost did it, but that fell through, with him being penciled in to direct Episode 9. Then Ben Affleck and Neil Blomkamp apparently both denied the film. Finally, Steven Spielberg told Kathleen Kennedy to just stop looking at all these random people and just have J.J. Abrams do it, especially given his recent involvement in Star Trek. And it was announced soon after, in January 2013, that he would be the director. One thing J.J. Abrams was keen to do was write a bunch of mysteries, and had the philosophy for this film that emotion should come over lore and explanation. A welcomed thesis after George Lucas's lore-heavy prequel films, but one that would bite the sequel trilogy in the ass as time went on. We'll just leave it at the fact that Kathleen went on record to say they had elements of a plan for the sequel trilogy, but they were mostly just going to fly by the seat of their pants and make it happen.
Just a yes or no, you still do not have a plan.
I have concepts of a plan, but if we come up with something, I would only change it if we come up with something that's better and less expensive. And there are concepts and options we have to do that.
Around this time, Lucasfilm would draw the line in the sand a bit and create Star Wars' new canon, replacing the former long-running continuity, with the exception of the Clone Wars cartoon and, of course, the core films, but everything else wouldn't be canon to further Lucasfilm creations in the Disney era. This clarification allowed the filmmakers to have more freedom to work with. This accompanied with Star Wars comics leaving their longtime home of Dark Horse Comics and going back to Disney and Marvel, along with new licensing deals being penned for video games, probably just made it easiest to start fresh. In November 2015, George Lucas did an interview with CBS talking about how Disney cut him out of Star Wars, saying they wanted to do a retro movie that was basically a remake and he wasn't into all that.
It's not about spaceships. So they decided they didn't want to use those stories. They weren't that keen to have me involved anyway, but at the same time I said, I'm not going to, if I get in there, I'm just going to cause trouble. And it really does come down to a simple rule of life, which is when you break up with somebody, the first rule is no phone calls. It's not about spaceships.
Kathleen Kennedy did mention in an interview that George Lucas saw and liked the film, but he never said it personally, so she could have been lying.
The third one is you don't show up at their coffee shop or the things what you're going to run in. You just say, no, gone, history, I'm moving forward.
I can't imagine how awkward that screening was. Probably felt like meeting your ex-wife's new kid with your cousin or some shit.
Don't go over to their house and drive by to see what they're doing.
Disney had many casting ideas for this film, including adding Ryan Gosling, Leonardo DiCaprio, Zac Efron, and Michael B. Jordan. They were all considered before there was even really a script. But later on, the company decided to just cast more unknown actors, or, little-known actors at least, with John Boyega, Daisy Ridley, Adam Driver, and the CGI actor Andy Serkis joining the original cast of Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, Mark Hamill, and Anthony Daniels. Finally, Billie Lourd would have a bit part. She was Carrie Fisher's daughter, originally going for the Rey role, but landing another role as something of a legacy casting. The film took approximately 3 months to film and cost in the ballpark of $447 million to produce after tax credits, with the total actually being around $533 million spent. This made the movie the most expensive film ever created, only beating Jurassic World: The Fallen Kingdom by a fairly small margin after tax breaks. Though if we consider the pre-tax budget adjustment, it is more expensive by almost $100 million than the second highest. Disney and Lucasfilm were gambling a lot on this thing being a success, and the checkbook was wide open for this one to ensure that success. The story takes place in 34 ABY, or 30 years following the Empire's crippling at Endor, with Poe Dameron on Jakku, meeting with Lor Santeca, a friend of the missing Jedi hero Luke Skywalker, who can point him to Luke's whereabouts. However, as Poe and his droid BB-8 get the map segment, the village therein is attacked by Kylo Ren, Captain Phasma, and a group of First Order troopers. Poe is captured, but BB-8 makes it off with Kylo Ren capturing the ace pilot to gain Resistance intel after killing Lor Santeca. Anyhow, during all this, Stormtrooper FN-2187, later known as Finn, is panicking now that he's finally seen combat, scared for his life as the village is raided, and this motivates him to save Poe from Imperial capture after they return him to Kylo Ren's flagship. Meanwhile, on Jakku, Rey, a local scavenger, finds BB-8 and befriends the droid, who asks for help to get some important information to the Resistance. Rey, a small-town country girl, is excited to see some action, so she agrees. This is when Finn and Poe crash land after a rocky escape from the First Order. Though in the confusion, Finn thinks Poe has died and ends up bumping into Rey after BB-8 realizes Finn is wearing his master Poe's jacket. Though this is when the Empire arrives and starts shooting the place up, trying to find BB-8. Rey and Finn find the Millennium Falcon, which is conveniently in the scrapyard on Jakku, fully functional, and after a chase, escape to space. Not long after, though, they are confronted and pulled into a ship which is piloted by none other than Han Solo, who shows up like a moderately famous guest star on The Big Bang Theory or some shit.
Chewie.
They literally pause for a second for audience reaction. In fact, later on they do this for Leia too. No, but seeing Harrison Ford as Han back in the Falcon is cool, so I'll allow it. Anyhow, Han and Chewie agree to help the duo after hearing what information BB-8 had, since the map held the location of Luke Skywalker, and he knows if Leia and the Resistance are trying to dig out the exiled Luke, stuff must be going down with the First Order. Anyhow, Kanja Club
Kanja Club wants their investment back too. I never made a deal with Kanja Club.
Shows up and a giant hentai monster tears up the freighter that Han was using, leaving room for them to use the Falcon for the whole film in its place. Anyhow, this is when we learn a new super Death Star, the Starkiller base, is constructed, and Kylo Ren and Hux, one of his Imperial officer guys, wants to explode the entire New Republic with it, along with the Resistance and Supreme Leader Snoke, this weird Voldemort-looking guy who is apparently the new Palpatine, tells them to just go for it. Though Snoke is concerned that Kylo Ren will be seduced to the light side of the Force, which is also a talking point of this meeting, and like, that's not how it works. I know we're doing the plot now, and I'll talk about my thoughts later, but like, the lore of the dark side is that it's easy, addictive power fueled by hate and anger, and a slippery slope that's hard to come out of. That's like being addicted to meth and your drug dealer is calling you to make sure that you don't casually start quitting meth. Like, it's just not how it works, unfortunately. Anyhow, Han, Chewie, Rey, and Finn go to Takodana, where they meet Maz Kanata, who tells them some mystic stuff that isn't all that helpful, but most importantly, she has Anakin Skywalker's Clone Wars lightsaber, the one that Luke inherited and lost on Cloud City, which calls to Rey and somehow survived falling on Cloud City. And for the benefit of the audience, Maz says,
Where'd you get that?
A good question. For another time.
Which, like, no, seems like a story that could be told now, actually. The lightsaber fell down the same endless pit as Luke did. Did that pit have a floor? Or did it land on the gas giant of Bespin below Cloud City? Who recovered it? Why? How? This is definitely a story for today, actually, because it makes no sense. I also like how the lightsaber survived an endless pit just fine, but the dog shit Acolyte TV show had a lightsaber casing smashed with the kyber crystal below with just a tiny toss. I guess lightsaber durability is based solely on plot convenience in this universe. Whatever, though. The Starkiller base goes off and blows up a bunch of random planets in the Hosnian system. Who cares, though, since we unironically never saw any of these planets before in the history of Star Wars. Though one kind of looks like Coruscant, so I guess you might get confused by that and think the stakes are higher. Kylo Ren and his gang find out about BB-8's location on Takodana, causing a small battle between the Cantina patrons and the First Order, with Finn trying to dip until he sees Rey captured by Kylo Ren, as the Resistance shows up to save the day, with Kylo Ren running off with Rey having what he needs. Leia shows up and tells Han to save their son Kylo Ren, as he needs a space intervention to make him a good guy, I guess. Han Solo is forced to seduce their son back to the light side, so he heads off. The Resistance decide they need to counterstrike the Starkiller base, and Han, Finn, and Chewie head to save Rey from Kylo Ren. But Rey was already busy saving herself, after Kylo Ren kind of just left her in her cell with an open door. Oh yeah, and Captain Phasma shows up and is apparently put in the garbage compactor after being bested.
Is there a garbage chute? Trash compactor?
Yeah, there is.
Guess they spared her for The Last Jedi though, since there was still more room to milk her unique design. Whatever. The group is gonna bomb the shields on Starkiller base for an X-Wing raid, but they meet with Kylo Ren, and Han readies his intervention with his son, who fakes out his dad and murders him. Everyone is sad, but they take off into the woods, with Rey and Finn forced to duel Kylo Ren. Finn is smoked, but Rey holds her ground till the X-Wings critically damage the Starkiller base, causing the thing to start to implode, making the Ren, I guess, flee in his spaceship, with Rey also fleeing when Chewie picks her up in the Falcon. Finn survives but is put on Bacta, and everyone's really sad that Han Solo died and got thrown down a pit. Chewie and Rey, now armed with BB-8's map to Luke Skywalker, decide to head out and get the Jedi, who they find only for him to turn around and the film cuts to black all dramatically. Rey is the lead of this film and is a mysterious Force-sensitive girl who is abandoned by her family at a young age on the desolate planet of Jakku in the shadow of one of the last major conflicts of the Imperial era, the Battle of Jakku, which was basically the Empire's last stand. She works scrapping the debris from that battle and lives in a small village in an old busted-down AT-AT, dreaming of the day her mysterious parents return. Eventually she meets BB-8 and then Finn, soon leading to them finding the Falcon, which brings them on their grand journey, where she discovers she's Force sensitive, and learns after helping to destroy the Starkiller base and finding the map to Luke Skywalker that perhaps her path is set to be that of the Jedi, as briefly suggested by Maz Kanata earlier in the film.
That lightsaber was Luke's, and his father's before him, and now it calls to you.
Look, in this film alone, I don't have any problems with Rey. She's pretty standard for protagonists. The setup's pretty normal. Rey is a quaint person with something special about her. Then they happen into an adventure that leads them to reaching their full potential. I don't find her particularly deep in this film, but I like this naive kid kind of finding her path to becoming a Jedi. Something we basically saw with Luke Skywalker back in the day. Even before Star Wars, I guess, woke haters came along, accusations of Rey being a Mary Sue were levied. And to that I say, Luke blew up the Death Star in an X-Wing he flew for the first time on the way up to the Death Star. He did fly previously, but those were only skyhoppers. That would be like me knowing how to fly a consumer small engine plane, then jumping into an advanced fighter jet and just being just as good at it, if not completely excelling compared to the other highly trained pilots. You may also say, well, she survived dueling Kylo Ren. Yeah, well, the will of the Force or whatever. Shut the fuck up. No one cares. My point is, Rey in this film is fine, but I think her biggest problem is she's too much of a blank canvas that J.J. Abrams set up for other people to deal with down the line. Finn is the second lead and might have a crush on Rey, which leads him to be on this crusade long enough to have a character arc.
Got a boyfriend? Cute boyfriend?
And no, this hinted romance doesn't go anywhere. Finn was a nameless Imperial who was sent to the front lines with Kylo Ren at the start of the film and suddenly realizes that war sucks and he didn't want to do it. So with the help of Poe, who he frees from the Star Destroyer, he in turn gets a pilot to bring him down to Jakku where he plans to make his escape. Though the pair crash and he eventually meets Rey after thinking Poe died. He lies and says he's part of the Resistance, so Rey will trust him, with Finn really just looking to get as far away from the First Order as humanly possible. This changes at the Battle of Takodana, though, after meeting Rey and Han Solo. Finn realizes that it isn't that he can't or doesn't want to fight, but he needs to fight for a cause worth fighting for, and being an unnamed drone in a shadow army wasn't really cutting it. At the start of the film, Finn is a deserter. By the end, he's taking up a lightsaber to fight Kylo Ren alone. I think that's a pretty good arc for a secondary protagonist. I think Finn has the best arc in the film, since he's the only one in the film allowed to progress beyond hints of Rey becoming a Jedi and Kylo killing his dad. This unfortunately would not keep up with Finn in the sequels, but we'll get around to that soon. Poe is the third lead, and for some reason Finn thought he was dead and took off without him after the duo crash landed on Jakku, only for him to have survived. This happened in real life to my uncle. His buddy got ejected from a car, and they thought he died, but they found him a couple hours later when they were towing the car off, under the car alive, just unconscious. So, this may sound dumb, but fuck it, I guess it's not impossible. It's happened before. Poe is kind of a joker in like a less charming Iron Man from Avengers kind of way.
So who talks first? You talk first? I talk first?
When he isn't joking around, he's kind of like a slightly more important version of Wedge Antilles from the original film. Like he has more screen time, but they're effectively the same character, just kind of the cocky young rogue, I guess. Han and Chewie are back, and they're just Han and Chewie. They pretty quickly come around to Rey and start to like this new girl. Han is affected by the loss of his son to the darkness, and Rey, in a small way, fills that void for him. The way Han, in turn, fills the father role for Rey.
You might need this.
I think I can handle myself.
I know you do. That's why I'm giving it to you. Take it.
Though outside of some sadder moments with the somber Han Solo, I think Harrison Ford picked up the role like riding a bike and just did it perfectly. He's older, he's tired of this shit, but he also has that Han Solo vibe that was so contagious in the original trilogy, and I think his death at the hands of Kylo Ren was a good moment, even if it was a shame we never got to see the core cast of Luke, Leia, and Han all in the same place before Han's death in the film. And of course, sadly, Carrie Fisher died in real life, so they're probably not going to be able to do it again. Leia plays a pretty small part in this film, but what we learn is her and Han had a kid, and the two are estranged following their son's corruption to the dark side. She also runs the mysterious Resistance to fight the First Order, so there you go. Kylo Ren is the new Darth Vader, or at least he really wants to be. He is the new not Sith leader of the Knights of Ren, and a senior figure in the First Order. He is the son of Han Solo and Leia Organa, and as a result is a legacy character, and not just in the literal sense. In one hand lies Kylo's chosen path as the new Vader, who he could be, with him even worshipping his grandfather's deformed mask.
And I will finish what you started.
And on the other hand lies his mother, the princess leader, and his father, the most infamous yet kind-hearted smuggler and war hero, and Luke, the last of the Jedi, proving that Kylo's allegiances are kind of being tugged two directions. Does he go more in his direct family's path, or does he follow what his grandfather did with the Empire? The film shows this balance poorly, instead implying Kylo is fighting his light side destiny as Anakin fought his darkness in the prequels.
By the grace of your training, I will not be seduced.
We shall see.
When in reality, Kylo has to choose between the light and the darkness, with both parts of that tugging at him, though he finally embraces the darkness after killing his father. I think the big problem with this is that the first fucking scene of this movie, Kylo Ren is super evil, brutally killing Lor San Tekka. I hate to suggest a rewrite on something that's been out for a decade, but perhaps he could have been the one they were looking for in the movie. Like, he disappeared instead of Luke, so everybody's running around trying to find him and try to keep him from going to the dark side or something, and then when they do find him, he's a Sith acolyte or something like that. It's just confusing, since there's this shadow of the doubt that Kylo might go back to the light side, despite that not really being choreographed within the film. We also don't hear much origin here on why he turned dark in the first place. He also runs the Knights of Ren, and at the time, no one knew what the hell that was. I don't know. It's a bit half-cooked, especially since the Sith basically just aren't a thing in this film. Like, this film is scared to call Kylo Ren or Snoke a Sith in the same way they're scared to call the Resistance the Rebels and the First Order the Empire. Also, Kylo Ren was Ben Solo, which makes no sense to me at all. Why would Han and Leia name their kid that? Han definitely knew Obi-Wan from A New Hope, and Leia knew of Obi-Wan at least to the point where she could send him a message. But only Han knew him as Ben Kenobi, since that was his alias on Tatooine. Leia knew him as Obi-Wan, and never even meets him directly in the movie. In the Legends continuity, their kids are named Anakin, Jason, and Janna. Not perfect names, but at least Anakin was named after Leia's dad as kind of a tribute to the man he was before Vader, but also to redeem that name to that of a hero's name. And Jason and Jaina are just random names they made up. It is Luke in Legends that named his kid Ben Skywalker, which to me makes perfect sense. Hear me out. Luke only knew Obi-Wan as his alias Ben. Ben also became close to Luke, who entered the Jedi path under him, even just for a brief while. It just makes no sense that Leia would name her kid that. Whatever. I just thought it was an odd creative choice, and why would they name their kid after Obi-Wan? There's so many better choices. I think at the end of the day, Kylo Ren.
No one sneaks up on Kylo Ren. My little force field sees to that.
Kylo Ren should have went one of two directions. He should have been a total puppet who wants to go good but fails out of fear, or had been a straight Vader clone. This film rides the line too much. It does a little of both and a lot of neither, and I don't even think they particularly knew what direction they wanted to go with Kylo Ren. Captain Phasma has little to nothing to do with this movie, but has a memorable design, so she shows up. This is admittedly like Boba Fett in Empire Strikes Back, who didn't have much going on, but Phasma is a little different because at least Boba Fett led the Cloud City capture of the Falcon crew along with Darth Vader, and got Han Solo to Jabba, despite doing very little, at least physically, in that first movie. But at least he pushes the plot a tiny bit. Phasma is a dick to Finn like twice at the start of the movie, and that's pretty much it. And based on her prominence in the marketing and merchandising, I suspect she was basically a character that looked cool in concept art, and they figured they could sell a lot of toys and shit for her. And I think before this film dropped, at least, that was kind of the case. Everybody was like, Captain Phasma looks badass, but then, she didn't really do anything. Also, in scenes, her suit is all smudged up and stuff, and it looks really bad. I know that was probably realistic for a metal suit like this, like how do you keep that clean? But just shine it up. She's a high-ranking First Order officer. She should look clean and shiny and proper as the Imperials do. At least in the original films, there was kind of this line between the rebels who were normal people and the Imperials who all wore like shiny, clean, and pristine white armor or like really fancy suits.
Well, the Emperor maintained control without the bureaucracy. The regional governors.
It's certainly a nitpick, but whatever. Also, she was shoved in the trash compactor off screen apparently, but then makes it out of that and then commandeers a ship to get off Starkiller Base and sort of just shows up in the next film. But like, why not just blast her brains across the wall or tie her up or something? Apparently they didn't subdue her very well either, since she got off Starkiller Base fairly easily. Whatever though. Snoke is the new mysterious Emperor, Sith Lord, I don't know. He's the supreme leader by title and created his own shadow army that eventually comes to power. What any of this entails, in this film at least, is not explained, and he's just another mystery box aspect and a scary, foreboding hologram man that leads to nothing in this film. For the purposes of this film, he's just kind of a thing that we know nothing about. Admiral Hux is basically the new Grand Moff Tarkin for this new era. He's posh, cleaned up, high-ranking Imperial guy who has no heart and is devious and evil, despite his lowly stature and a tone like he's part of the upper echelon of society. He fires off the Starkiller Base, destroying the Hosnian system, which, as I mentioned, was previously an unseen planet that I guess houses a lot of the resistance in New Republic, allowing for the First Order shadow government to come to power. This character is very Nazi-core, upping the ante from the original Star Wars, a more subtle take on this, by making the man Seagull like Hitler or something in front of a bunch of red First Order Nazi flags.
And we'll remember this as the last day of the Republic!
Subtlety was not something they planned with this scene, but it made a cool trailer shot. Tonally, this film is akin to the original Star Wars. J.J. Abrams wanted to create a film that makes you feel that nostalgia, adventure, fun, and dread, basically trying to emulate the vibe of A New Hope while sprinkling in a new sense of nostalgia upon seeing the returning cast: Han, Leia, Luke, Chewie, C-3PO, R2, the Falcon, X-Wings, TIE Fighters, and even a Temu Darth Vader.
I am a cunty Darth Vader for the modern day.
All these elements are here to really bring the original trilogy to the forefront of modern cinema, with the express goal of kickstarting this new and, in theory, improved Star Wars franchise that Disney was trying to build. This is sort of the opposite approach George Lucas was going for, with the prequels very much feeling like different films from the original trilogy, and his proposed sequel trilogy we mentioned seemingly set to feel quite different than the previous two eras.
The issue was, ultimately, they looked at the stories and they said, we want to make something for the fans. I said, all I wanted to do was tell a story of what happened.
I think this film sort of established a crutch for the franchise that is always sort of going to be based on the foundation of the original trilogy and fears moving forward. If there's one thing I find to be inarguably classic about this film is the music, with John Williams returning to do a score which was so necessary for this film to add cohesion with the rest of the franchise. Songs like Rey's theme are so fitting for the character's life on Jakku, but also feels in line with the series' core musical thesis, just applied to this particular character, if that makes sense. It's really nice. Things like The Mandalorian or the spin-off films I get going in different musical directions, especially since John Williams is 300 years old and probably can't do all of these. But I think, especially in this deeply ingrained with nostalgia legacy sequel that's part of the mainline films, they made the right choice to add him to the crew. The editing was handled by Mary Jo Markey, who is basically the editing partner of J.J. Abrams. She edited everything with him practically. This film, the Star Trek films, Mission Impossible 3, and worked on shows such as Lost. She worked with Marianne Brandon, who worked with her on numerous projects as well, but also did films that Mary Jo didn't do, such as Venom, How to Train Your Dragon, and Grumpier Old Men. The editing is good enough and emulates Star Wars feel based on what Paul Hirsch, Marcia Lucas, and Richard Chew did on the original film. Wipes, fast-paced editing, etc., but it keeps up a good pace. Dan Mindell did the cinematography, and honestly, the film looks really good. I don't think any other film in the series, besides possibly The Last Jedi, compares to this film from a cinematography standpoint. Part of it is, of course, technology, which I think robbed the original trilogy of being able to really compete on that level. And don't get me wrong, I think the original trilogy has some really good cinematography. My favorite shot always being Luke under the twin suns, just eternally. I think that's everyone's favorite shot. I think that's universal. But the shot composition and integrated practical and CGI effects are just really impressive, especially for 2015 when things were still heavily influenced by CGI. The film was also shot on 35mm film cameras with some 65mm IMAX shots integrated into the film as well for certain moments. Moments like Rey exploring the carcass of an old Star Destroyer, the battle on Maz's castle, and the final fight against Kylo Ren in the woods, I think look really nice. The renders on things that are CGI look really great, along with some really nice puppeteering on the things that are practical. It doesn't look like a CGI nightmare as the prequels did, and the practical creatures feel yanked straight from the original trilogy while also being tastefully enhanced by CGI. Not to mention, the world just feels very lived in, with the Star Destroyer carcass, the Millennium Falcon interiors being kind of beaten up, and Maz's castle having some grime and damage from a millennia of abuse. I think I'd be remiss not to mention the mystery box concept. This film sets up two new armies, the First Order and the Resistance, but in no way establishes why these factions exist in the context of Star Wars. Last we saw in film, the Rebels won to create a new democracy, and the Empire was all but in tatters following Vader and the Emperor's demise with the second Death Star. In this film, we get literally no context on the acting government of the galaxy. We also don't know why the grassroots resistance came to fight the First Order. While there's seemingly little to no officially sanctioned military by the New Republic, if the resistance is said military, then why is it called the Resistance and not the New Republic Defense Force or something like it was in Legends? I read a lot of these novels and stuff, and I've yet to really grasp these concepts, but even so, I think the film needs more than a small piece of exposition in the opening crawl which states, "With all support from the Republic, General Leia Organa leads a brave resistance." What does that mean? Why doesn't the Republic have an army of its own? I feel like it's a lazy attempt to have the name the Resistance because it's kind of close to Rebels, but if they called themselves the Rebels, that wouldn't really make sense in the context of this film, since the New Republic is the acting government. As for the First Order, it is said to have risen from the ashes of the Empire after Luke Skywalker vanished. The title crawl kind of implied like Luke Skywalker was the only thing keeping the First Order away, and his disappearance allowed them to grow. All this is fine, but I think the name kind of sucks. This may sound too simple, but what if there's one faction called the New Republic and one called the Empire, or the New Empire, or the New Order, or something? I don't know. What does the First in First Order really stand for? I suppose my point is, down to the foundation of this story, this whole film is kind of a mystery box. Another question we have is, where's Luke Skywalker and why did he leave? What is he up to? Of course, some of these questions, like where Luke Skywalker was and why he left, are answered in the sequel film. The mystery of Luke Skywalker's original lightsaber, the one that Anakin used during the Clone Wars, was also cast off as
A good question for another time.
a story we never learned, by the way, not in film at least. We see a flash of the Knights of Ren, and we follow a non-Sith evil Jedi villain Kylo Ren, so naturally lots of speculation as to what they were all about was levied. This film doesn't answer that question though. The sequel doesn't really bother either, though the Kylo Ren comic series kind of fills in the blanks on that. Though, I think if you're going to have Kylo, a non-Sith, Sith-like guy, it may have been more pertinent to explain that, but hey, what do I know about film writing? Rey's parents are another group of mystery people that were speculated about, leading to the twist in The Last Jedi that they were just random nobodies, something that J.J. Abrams amended when he took the reins on The Rise of Skywalker, when they clarified that they actually were nobodies, except for the tiny detail that her dad was a clone of Palpatine, but other than that.
dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
Finally, you have Snoke, who is the new Emperor man who has no explanations in this film. Eventually, we see him killed in The Last Jedi in a shock twist that promised he would never be properly explained. Though fear not, because The Rise of Skywalker has a shot for like a single millisecond that shows him in a test tube. I guess he was a clone or a science experiment or something. Palpatine wore him like a spooky mask, kind of like a Scooby-Doo villain or some shit, I think. Anyways, all this to say, J.J. Abrams established a lot of mystery in this film that he made for vibes, and at the time of this film's release, he planned to explain absolutely none of them, with Rian Johnson taking over the 8th entry and Colin Trevorrow set to do the 9th. As we will cover, Rian Johnson didn't want these random plot lines and seeked out to basically half-ass solve most of them in subversive ways, which pissed off a lot of people. Then J.J. Abrams was basically forced to say, wait a minute. Then he pretty much retconned what was in the 8th movie and used the 9th movie to explain everything rather than tell the plot of the 9th movie. These mystery boxes created an obvious problem. The writers, who weren't going to do 8 or 9, created shit that the filmmakers behind 8 and 9 needed to deal with no answers or guidance on what the game plan was. The film opens a lot of plot threads, and the studio started banging out the next film without any real plan on what was going to happen in the other films. I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but if I had to describe what went wrong with the trilogy as simply as possible, I would say that the trilogy failed because it lacked pre-production that was needed for the trilogy to be truly cohesive. Disney knew they had 3 in the books day one. Pen to ink with George Lucas in 2012, they knew they wanted a new trilogy. So the biggest, most baffling question you have to ask is why there was no outline. Why did they add so many random plot threads and more? I don't think on its release, Force Awakens really suffered from these issues, since I think the Star Wars fandom was largely kept alive on the back of what the answers to these questions were. But as we add The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker to the picture, you see this film is set up for 2 films that argue with each other over what the ideology and story of this film was, and makes the whole thing kind of crumble apart. People sometimes say this film is just a remake of the original Star Wars, and yeah, kinda, but I don't know if I would go that far. The film starts on Rey on a sand planet, not unlike the original, but Jakku is a bit different than Tatooine. For one, Rey is an orphan and a scavenger. Luke was just an oblivious kid. Also, the look and feel of Jakku is quite a bit different. Tatooine is hard dirt and just vast fields, whereas Jakku is sand dunes. It's also a boneyard for old Imperial and Rebel gear from the end of the Galactic Civil War. In both films, the villains are after a droid for an embedded MacGuffin. In the original, it was the Death Star schematics. In this film, it's a map to Luke Skywalker. Similar, but both lead to different end goals. In this film, Kylo wants to track and kill Luke, and the Resistance wants to try recruiting the reclusive Jedi. In the original, the Death Star plans can lead to an exploitable weakness or a better understanding of the super weapon. I feel stakes were a bit lower here. The Resistance plan is to get Luke Skywalker, I guess, to fight Kylo Ren, and Kylo Ren wants to fight Luke or obliterate him with the Starkiller base. I'm actually a bit confused as to what the conflict is, though, since both are different means to the same end, though I guess whoever has it may have a minor handicap. If Luke comes to fight, then he can fight Kylo on his terms. If Kylo gets it, he can nuke Luke or sneak up on him. I suppose it kind of makes some sense, but the exact ends of the plans are fairly unelaborated on. Also, what will the Jedi do? In the previous 6 films, we see the Jedi is powerful enough on a micro battle level, but changing the tides of the war, no, that's not really how the Jedi work. This film has Han Solo mentor Rey and fill a similar role to Obi-Wan's in the original. This is actually a good thematic change, I think. In the original, Han thought Obi-Wan was a total quack, so now he's put in the position of introducing a new Jedi prodigy to the Force, something at one point he thought was more or less bullshit.
Hokey religions and ancient weapons are no match for a good blaster at your side, kid.
It's true. The Force, the Jedi. All of it.
Rey also grows a similar connection to Han that Luke had to Obi-Wan, which is also a slightly uncomfortable position for Han Solo to be in. I really like this. In this film, we have the Starkiller base, which harnesses the power of Ithor, the planet the Jedi created lightsabers on once upon a time, but this time it's basically just the Death Star, but again, This felt completely unnecessary and just a way to outdo the original film. I also find this kind of strange. I mean, in the original, the Empire, which controlled thousands of planets, created the Death Star, a giant small moon-sized super weapon. Impossible, sure, but I can suspend my disbelief, especially since parts can be flown from one place then assembled in space. Like, sure, I guess it makes sense, sorta. In this film, the First Order, a fringe government with little formal power, gets the budget and workers to assimilate an entire living planet into a super weapon that can suck suns through it in seconds, remain stable, and shoot a laser so strong it can wipe out whole star systems. I don't know, my belief is no longer suspended at that. I feel like that would take generations at best, and felt like something they added to just outdo the originals, and honestly, the subplot is so background to the main plot, which is save Rey and confront Kylo Ren, that it just kind of felt pointless. The climax could have just as easily been Han goes to save Rey and confront his kid. Simple as that. No need for anything further. I guess it explains how the New Republic was crippled, but I find it wild that all operations for the New Republic and the Resistance left every system in the galaxy except the Hosnian system. Like, nothing is happening on Coruscant, nothing's happening on Naboo, Hoth. It's all happening on the Hosnian system, a system we, as the viewers, have never even heard of. In the next film, we see that the Resistance was totally crippled. Barely anyone is left. Also, when they destroy the Starkiller base, I would figure they would kill billions. Like, what about the inevitable slave labor the First Order used to build it? The men, women, children, droids, animals. I know it wouldn't have been as cool, but I feel like the Resistance or New Republic would more want to disable the weapon and capture the planet than just fucking obliterate it. In the original films, destroying the Death Star probably killed millions, but most of them were just Imperials. So I don't know. It wasn't nearly as heinous as just making all of Ilum's life go extinct along with the First Order members on there. I guess it was for the greater good or whatever. But I found that pretty dumb. It was also so in the background that I didn't find it as important as destroying the Death Star in the original movie, where Luke Skywalker had an active role in it. Just leave the super weapon out of the film, in all honesty, is what I'm trying to say. It seems pretty pointless. Kylo Ren is a Darth Vader-like character. I don't mind the similarity since it plays into his arc. Finally, tonally, it's similar as we covered, so is it a remake of the original Star Wars? Not really. It does take a lot of elements, including some I think the film could have done without, but I wouldn't go so far as to call it a straight remake, since it remixes it all enough that I think it feels fairly distinct, and it doesn't really bother me despite it bothering other people. Overall, despite complaining throughout this video, I don't really hate this movie. It's a solid movie with a lot of plot holes and even more bad payoffs, in part due to the sequels. Not to mention the sequels I mentioned are pretty much unwatchable, which makes this movie an even harder watch. It's good in the same ways Spider-Man No Way Home was, and messy in the same way that film was. Nothing makes fucking sense at all, but when Han Solo walks onto the Falcon or Leia shows up or Luke for a bit, I fall for the nostalgia bait, and admittedly, it's kind of fun to see. Of course, Disney, as a studio especially, has started to extend my nostalgia bait ability to its last shred of patience, so I think retroactively the excitement that I used to get from this film wore a little thin. I also think on a wider sense, this film does make me feel like I'm watching Star Wars. I just feel like I'm watching a very, very poorly thought out Star Wars film. This film was a rush job, too. I mean, Disney and George Lucas put pen to paper on the Lucasfilm acquisition 3 years and 2 months before this film came out. And like clockwork, each sequel in this film would drop 2 years after the last, with spin-offs in between each entry, those being Rogue One after this and Solo after The Last Jedi. The plan at the time was to make 1 or 2 Star Wars films per year, and to just keep the crazy production value and budget this film had with tight stories to match and people coming back to the theater was nigh impossible, and it shows with the sloppy work in both this film and the sloppier work of its sequels. Not to mention, I don't really love Rogue One and Solo. Well, I actually like Solo in spite of the project's numerous issues, but it's not the best thing I've ever seen. Also, transitioning to lower stakes TV shows has been hit or miss, basically season to season for me, and I think some of the same problems this film has are featured heavily in shows like Obi-Wan and Boba Fett. though I think we got a few solid shows, and I also think making a bad Disney Plus show is a little less painful for the brands than a bad theatrical release. Disney is coming back in the next year with the Mandalorian Grogu movie, and I see some glaring issues with that idea, like the fact that the first 3 projects from them were on TV. But I think at the same measure, it'll be nice to see Star Wars back in theaters where it belongs. It also seems the timelines have laxed and that future releases will have more time to cook and just kind of come out when they're ready. Hopefully when the films start coming back, this rings true and they don't start trying to do rush jobs if The Mandalorian and Grogu is successful. The Force Awakens made just over $2 billion on a budget of $533 million, or $447 million after tax breaks. Merchandise at the time was also very successful, so it made money and did really well. Critics also really enjoyed the film, with it scoring an overly generous score of 93% on Rotten Tomatoes or an 80 out of 100 on Metacritic. It was a critical darling despite its flaws, and I'll concede I do find the movie fairly charming, so I guess I sort of get it. Also, Disney is really, really good at marketing to critics, if I'm being honest. A lot of those Marvel movies, tad bit overrated.